I'm suggesting that how we go about setting boundaries is just as important as the boundary itself. And that's where I feel like we don't really spend a lot of time on. We spend a lot of time on how to create boundaries or how to communicate to somebody that there's a boundary violation here, but we don't often talk about why we're setting that boundary. What is behind that boundary setting? And is it setting a boundary from a place of wounding, from a place of fear, from a place of lack? Or are we setting boundaries from a place of integrity, a place of honesty? Hey everyone, I'm Thais Sky. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women by women on conversations that matter. Hello, everybody. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast. I am back for part 7 of the Reclaiming Worth series. If you did not get the memo from the episode yesterday, last August, I did a 5-part series called Reclaiming Worth. Not only was it so well received, I have a lot more to say. So I decided, why not do another 5-part series in honor of the doors opening to my group program, Worthy Women Rise. So let's talk today about boundaries. I have many thoughts around boundaries. There's a lot of conversations out there right now about boundaries. I think that boundaries has become a buzzword. It's become a thing. Everybody wants to have boundaries now. It's become very much embedded in what self-care culture looks like. It's a part of our relationshiping and how we connect with other people. I think we're just becoming so fed up with how fast the pace of this world is and how much demand there is on our time, that the only way that we can possibly stay grounded is by having boundaries. So I love that more and more people are talking about boundaries, that people are talking about how we can be beautiful and kind and generous and loving and compassionate while also having boundaries, right? One doesn't necessarily equal the other. There's a lot of incredible conversation out there about how women's time have traditionally been not respected. And so women have a hard time setting boundaries. We have a hard time navigating what it looks like to say no and to ask for what we need and to say that behavior is not acceptable anymore. And so because we haven't been trained, it's very hard for us to figure out how to do it. And yet when we do it, it can be so relieving. So there's a lot to the conversation of boundaries, and this is one of the modules of Worthy Women Rise. So I go in depth in this conversation in the program. This episode is by no means a full spectrum of everything I have to say about boundaries, because I think it's such an important and necessary conversation, and it's one of the places where our unworthiness or our worthiness wound comes up a lot. When we're talking about boundaries, that's when we're really asked to look at how we've allowed people to treat us, how people have treated us, whether we've allowed it or not, and what we're willing to do about it. Boundaries brings up a lot of sense of I'm not worthy to ask for what I want and what I need. Boundaries bring up a lot of I'm not deserving of that. I should be more understanding. I should be more compassionate. And so I think it's really important when we're talking about reclaiming worth that we cultivate space to explore boundaries. So today I want to talk about 2 kind of things that I've been sitting with a lot when it comes to boundaries. One, it's this idea of rigid versus flexible boundaries. And the other idea is, well, you're just going to have to hear it. Listen to the rest of the episode to get to point numero dos. But let's go to this idea that rigid boundaries are not sustainable. I actually wrote an Instagram post that I'm just going to literally read verbatim because I think it's really important. So I wrote, I would like to dispel the narrative that self-care means setting big, bold, hard boundaries. Another word for that are rigid boundaries. And that's a word that I like to use. I like to use this idea of rigid boundaries. Okay. So the post goes, I know that as women, we have a hard time setting boundaries. The worthiness wound set up by societal standards drives us to people please, to say yes to everything, to allow people to treat us like shit. We're not taught how to advocate for our needs because, let's be honest here, women are predominantly taught to stay silent. Okay, so that's everything that I just shared, right? And then I go on to say, But I do not believe the antidote is necessarily harder boundaries and thicker skin. In fact, whenever I see someone with rigid boundaries and an air of righteousness, what I sense is that they are operating from their wound. It may be helpful temporarily to bring us back to safety, but unexamined in the long term, it only leads to further wounding. Fear-based boundaries, such as Trump's wall, serves no one. In addition, teaching women to have big, hard boundaries further perpetuates individualistic narratives that says that we don't need one another, which means ultimately it doesn't really teach us how to relate to each other with mutual respect and integrity, which I think is what we're really wanting when we say we need greater boundaries. Isolation is not the answer to violation. What I'm saying is that there's a complexity here, and that the invitation is to approach boundary setting in a way that is both soft and strong, both fluid and clear, both self-honoring and inviting. We don't have to abandon each other to belong to ourselves. Now, obviously, in that post, I'm not saying that boundary setting is not important. I think it's critical for our well-being and the well-being of those around us. I'm suggesting that how we go about setting boundaries is just as important as the boundary itself. And that's where I feel like we don't really spend a lot of time on. We spend a lot of time on how to create boundaries or how to communicate to somebody that there's a boundary violation here. But we don't often talk about why we're setting that boundary. What is behind that boundary setting? And is it setting a boundary from a place of wounding, from a place of fear, from a place of lack? Or are we setting boundaries from a place of integrity, a place of honesty? Now, later in this series, I am going to talk about relationship and intimacy, where I'm going to dive even more into this idea of like belonging to each other and holding the tension and being with each other. So stay tuned for that. But today, I really want to focus on like what it means to have rigid boundaries. And one thing that I talked about yesterday, when I talked about the surprising ways that the worthiness wound comes up, is this idea of righteousness. Now, every time I see righteousness come up, I also see rigidity. They seem to go hand in hand. In order for us to feel morally righteousness in something, there's a rigidity. There's a lack of ability of holding nuance. We have to see things as black and white. That's kind of inherent in righteousness, is that rigid sense of self, that rigid sense of understanding. And when we talk to people who are morally righteous or who are very rigid in their beliefs, you kind of get this sense that underneath this really hard exterior is a lot of self-doubt, right? When you look at people who are like really having to like force their way into the world, that they're actually experiencing a lot of worthiness and a lot of sense of they don't belong here. They should not exist. And so the same goes when we set rigid boundaries. Rigid boundaries come from this place of, I can't trust you, I can't trust myself, so I'm going to set this boundary, and no matter what you do, if you violate it, you're done. I'm cutting you out. I'm not tolerating any sort of flexibility. Okay, now we can see how in some cases having rigid boundaries or very clear, like strong boundaries is the answer. In fact, it's the only answer. It's the only way to go. Some of this is like, we know that we have codependent tendencies, and like setting these hard boundaries is the only way that we're going to be able to deal with the pain of the separation, right? There are instances where rigid boundaries is necessary, but it should not be, or I guess I'm inviting us to consider that even when there is a need for a rigid boundary, let's not let that be the last thing. Like, let's examine why there needs to be that rigidity. If you're establishing rigidity because of codependent tendencies, okay, set that boundary. You need that boundary. That's important. And then let's start to examine the codependency, and let's start healing the place within us that needs to be codependent, so that then our boundary in the future, moving forward with new relationships or whatever, can become more flexible. Do you see that? I'm not saying that rigid boundaries are bad or wrong. Notice I am not placing any judgments on it. Sometimes that's exactly what we need to cultivate safety within ourselves or within our external world. I am simply suggesting that like wherever there is rigid boundaries, there is a wounding. And so put the boundaries you need, and then let's examine the wound. Let's examine the pain underneath so that you can then breathe and cultivate boundaries that are breathable, that are flexible. Because what happens when we create rigid boundaries, it's not that we're creating these boundaries around other people. It's not like that we're keeping people out. I mean, we are, but we're also keeping ourselves in. Right? Rigid boundaries don't just affect other people, it affects ourselves. It limits our capacity to be with nuance, to be with the gray zone. And so when we start to establish more flexible boundaries, we also allow ourselves space to breathe and grow and become stronger and better and more resilient. Rigidity is very inflexible. Well, obviously, that's the term. That's the definition of rigidity. What am I trying to say? Rigidity is very breakable. That's what I'm trying to say. If you see something that's really, really rigid, it tends to be also very brittle. Just look at trees, the very rigid trees that don't bend in the wind, right? What happens? They break with the windstorm. They crack. As opposed to look at palm trees. They're very supple. They're very flexible. What happens in the wind? They're able to go with it. And if we imagine wind being the inevitable challenges of life, we want to be able to be flexible. So why do we set up rigid boundaries in the first place? Well, when we get hurt, betrayed, abused, when we're abandoned, we immediately attempt to protect ourselves by putting up defenses. We don't want to be in pain, and we will do anything we can to prevent that pain from happening again. For some of us, that defense comes in the form of rigid boundaries, okay? So rigid boundaries often looks like avoiding intimacy and closeness to prevent vulnerability and rejection. And that can look like having specific rules about how people should behave and cutting them off completely if they don't align. It can also look like being unable to ask for help. It can look like seeing things very black and white, being unforgiving, etc., etc. So for me, for example, when I was in the throes of my bulimia binge eating disorders, which I'm actually having a whole episode talking about food and worthiness, which is something I don't talk about too often. So I'm really excited to share that with you either tomorrow or the next day. But while I was in the throes of my bulimia and binge eating disorders, I had so many rules about what to eat and how to eat and when to exercise. And I created these boundaries for myself in order to support myself. But it was really coming from unworthiness. It was really coming from abandonment trauma. And that's when I began to see for myself that wherever there exists rigidity, there's a wound underneath. That's when I started to realize that I had created all these rules for myself and other people and how they could treat me. But really what that was doing was limiting my life. It was narrowing the scope of what I could deal with. And again, that's not inherently bad. Sometimes that's what's necessary. It's just let's be clear that that's what's happening. And then when it is no longer necessary, when we have other tools in our arsenal, we can choose a different tool. We can choose a different way of defending ourselves against the pains of life that's not preventing intimacy, okay? So in many ways, we set up rigid boundaries because we can't tolerate the uncomfortable emotions that are asking for attention. If you notice anything about my work, it's at the core of so much of our pain is around uncomfortable emotions. And this is no different. So when we're in pain, it makes so much sense that we don't want to be in more pain. So we try to push people away. So I keep iterating because I want to drill this in. I think this is really important. We've got to be tender and compassionate to ourselves where we have rigid boundaries or really any form of rigidity. Because of course, while it's coming from a wound, that doesn't mean that we should villainize ourselves, right? That doesn't mean that we should call ourselves bad and wrong. We're choosing the best tool that we knew how. And what I love about Worthy Women Rise is that, I don't take away people's defenses. I don't take away the ways that we relate to the world. I just invite in a different way of looking at the world so that we slowly start to heal from the pain and then we don't need those defenses anymore. So I'm not saying don't have rigid boundaries. I'm saying let's get curious why we have rigid boundaries. Okay? Because it's important to understand that rigid boundaries aren't sustaining. They lack flexibility and context. They prevent us from responding to life. Rigid boundaries are very reactive. They come at the cost of emotional depth and genuine connection. It's just not the answer to healthy relating and expanding our capacity to be with complexity. As I've shared a lot, society tells us that the answer to any conflict or rupture in a relationship is bigger, bolder, more rigid boundaries. And I'm just offering that there is another way. There is a way that we can offer kind of softness to our boundaries so that we don't have to abandon each other to belong to one another, or abandon each other to belong to ourselves. And I believe that that's worthiness. I believe worthiness is key to setting up more flexible boundaries. And so my invitation, my homework for you all as you're thinking about boundaries is just to look at where you may have rigid boundaries. Like, where may you be demanding that people behave a certain way in order for you to let them into your life? Just notice where you may be inflexible, whether it's rules for yourself or rules for other people. And then just notice, like, what are you trying to keep out by having this rigid boundary? Because we're preventing pain, right? So get clear on what that is. And then also notice, like, what are you missing out on by having these boundaries? And I'm not taking away the rigid boundaries. We're just getting curious that they exist. And what happens is when we cultivate awareness, the behavior slowly changes. Okay? Here's another thing that I want us to be thinking about, and this is something that's been coming up for me a lot lately, is the use of boundaries as a form of punishment. How often have we done this, right? How often have we put up this rigid boundary as a way to punish people for not doing what we want, right? We push people away for hurting us, and so then we set up these rigid boundaries. I had a friend once who we were very close. We were texting each other all the time. We were, hanging out all the time and doing all these things. And as the relationship started to reach a point where, like, we weren't sure if it was still working, if the relationship was still copacetic or still feeling really good for both of us, she texted me one day and said, I've decided that I'm only going to be on my phone twice a day for 30 minutes. In the morning and in the evening. And because you have an abandonment wound, I just want to let you know that I was doing this so that you know that it's not about, I don't want you to think that I'm abandoning you. I'm just letting you know I have this new boundary for myself. Now, while I, of course, I guess, appreciate her naming my abandonment wound, I did feel a little bit like she was using my wound as a weapon there. I do appreciate the sentiment, but what I didn't really appreciate was how rigid that boundary was. Like, really? You're only going to be on your phone twice a day for 30 minutes? Does that seem feasible? Does that seem likely? It felt to me like she was using that boundary as a way to punish the friendship, because I knew that she wasn't really not going to be on her phone every other time of the day. Yeah? And so she was putting up those boundaries that felt very honest for her. It felt very real for her, like she needed to put those boundaries because being on her phone was giving her a lot of pain. But the invitation isn't necessarily to then have these rigid rules of I'm only going to reach my phone, once a day or whatever, but rather, like, what's the pain and how can I hold tenderness to it? We often have, we put boundaries around, like, social media, for instance. Like, we only go on social media for 15 minutes once a day. Again, there's nothing wrong with that rule, but we got to ask ourselves, like, why, right? Why do we have a need to put such a strong, rigid boundary in place? Is it because social media is overwhelming, or is it because it's feeding into your worthiness wound and you're falling into comparitis again and again? What other type of boundaries could you put in place instead so you can feel expansive and free to go on social media whenever you want, and whatever happens on social media doesn't activate and trigger you? So again, a millionth time here, people. So I think this is really important for us to hear. There's no judgment in having any type of boundary. But let's get curious, and let's not use boundaries as a form of punishment. Because when we use a tool like boundaries, something that's so critical to our rise, that is so critical to our well-being, and we use it as a tool to dehumanize other people and to prevent connection and to disengage from a relationship, what we're really doing there is we're cultivating a sense of distrust within ourselves. I mean, not only do we get the punishment on the other end because we're discontinuing a connection, right? We're trying to protect ourselves, but we're really pushing and suppressing down our pain. And that never leads to long-lasting health and happiness. So I want to talk about a little tool that I found to be helpful for me as I've been navigating boundaries. And that's the what's mine, what's not mine tool. So what's mine, what's not mine works like this. When we're feeling emotionally caught up in a tangly, complicated relationship, as most of our relationships are, and gosh, we're just not sure what we need and what we want and what to say and blah, blah, blah. And we're feeling so much guilt and overwhelm and feelings, and there's a lot of emotional contagion happening. It's helpful to ask ourselves, like, what's mine in this situation? Like, what's mine to be responsible for? Let's see. Okay. My well-being is my responsibility, not somebody else's, right? My happiness is my responsibility, not something else's. Whether or not this happens is my responsibility, not somebody else's, blah, 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 blah. And then what's not mine? What am I taking on that is not mine? Sometimes taking on other people's feelings as yours is important. And then sometimes there's enmeshment there. Sometimes we're taking on other people's feelings because we're unconsciously trying to manipulate the situation to get our needs met. And so what is not mine here? Well, what's not mine is whether or not she's happy with what's happening, in this project or whatever. Maybe what's not mine is her disappointment in, what's happening. What's not mine? What's mine and what's not mine? What I love about that exercise is that first it names our responsibilities. I think it's important for us to be clear on what we're responsible for. Responsibility is response-able. It's being able to respond to what's happening. And I think it's important that we really name what's ours. And then it's really, really, really important to name what's not ours. Because we take on so much that's not our responsibility that we then get so overwhelmed by all the responsibility that then we don't do anything. We completely collapse, right? How often has that happened to you? Gosh, it's so many times where I've been so overwhelmed by how bad and wrong I am because of all the mess in the world that then it's like a cop-out. I don't actually have to then take real responsibility because I'm so overwhelmed. But if we use this tool of what's mine, what's not mine, we start to remove some of the burden that we've placed on ourselves. We start to recognize that there's so many things that are outside of our control, outside of our capacity to deal with, and that's okay. Because we still have this basket here of things that we can do, that we are able to respond to, that we're responsible for. What's mine, what's not mine? Sometimes it's helpful to even engage in this conversation with our significant others. If we're having a conversation, if we're having a fight and there's a misunderstanding, just to practice doing that to each other. Like first I would start and I would say, here's what's mine to take responsibility for and to own and to claim. And here's what's not mine. And then the partner can do the same. And it's very confronting because we often confuse love for enmeshment. We often think that being completely emotionally tied together is what love is, and that's not what love is. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about intimacy and relationships. But when we start to name what's not mine, we then have a freedom. We give other people permission and space to deal with their own shit. Because here's what's happening. When we take responsibility on from other people, we're infantilizing them. We're saying, you can't handle it. I'll handle it for you. Do you see that? We're not respecting other people's sovereignty when we're taking on their shit. Do you see that? This is boundary setting, is knowing it's not my responsibility whether or not that person is happy or not around whatever. Now, like I said, and I will be talking more about in the intimacy and relationship episode, relationships are not about independence, they're about interdependence. And so it's not about, now I don't give a shit about what they feel. We're allowed to feel for people. We're allowed to sympathize with them. We're allowed to hold space for them. But how often do we try to contort ourselves so that other people don't feel what they are feeling? How often do we take other people's pains on because it's intolerable for us to let them sit with their pain? You know what's happening in that moment? What we're saying is we don't trust ourselves to sit with our own pain. This has been very confronting for me. I've been recognizing all of the ways that not only do I have discomfort in feeling my emotions, and hell, I've been working with emotions for a very long time. Not only do I have a challenge with holding my emotions, I have a really hard time letting other people hold their emotions. Recently I had this conversation where I had a friend who really let me down. And when they apologized to me, I immediately wanted to be like, and I did. I was like, no, it's okay. It's okay. It's not a big deal. I should have communicated better. I should have done da da da. And my friend looked at me and they said, let me feel sorry. Let me be with the pain that I disappointed you. You do not have to take this away from me. I can handle this. I'm a grown up. I can handle my own emotions. And I realized how often I say that. I say, oh, it's okay, it's fine. Because I don't want to deal with not only my own disappointment of that person's behavior, but I don't want them to feel disappointed. And then what am I doing? I'm not letting them grow and evolve. I'm not letting them expand their capacity to be with their feelings because I'm trying to take that away from them. And that was a huge awakening for me. Again, boundaries is a beautiful gift where we actually can cultivate deeper intimacy. So wherever you notice that boundaries is actually preventing intimacy, where boundaries is actually cutting you off from life, from a sense of vitality and connection, odds are there's a rigidity there. There's a disconnect there. There's a misunderstanding of what boundaries are, because boundaries are life affirming. And so wherever you're feeling depleted or you're feeling confused about it, there's just some more investigation to do. It doesn't mean that the boundary that you set is wrong or bad. It just may mean that there's a reevaluation of the intention behind the boundary. And again, I'm not saying that boundary setting is always easy. Just because it's life affirming doesn't mean that it's easy. Sometimes it is really uncomfortable. Sometimes we have to have really hard conversations we do not want to have with ourselves and with other people. So let's remove right now the illusion that boundaries is some easy thing. I mean, I don't think many of us have that illusion, but just in case you did, boundaries aren't easy, but they're also not they're not like impossibly hard that you can't have them either. They're not on the other side where it's like impossible, and anytime you put on boundaries, it's going to be this huge conflict. That's not the case either. Okay, so that's it from me. I hope that this has resonated with you. If you are really excited about this series, if you're really enjoying this, please, please, please share with me on social. Tag me at I am Thais Sky or use hashtag Reclaim the Podcast. I love communicating and chatting with you all on social. I respond to all of my DMs. Truly, I do. It's one of my favorite things is to be connected with you all. So please let me know how this went for you. I had a beautiful listener share with me that she is so excited that this podcast is back because it's helped her really heal and tend to some capital T trauma that happened to her in her childhood. And this podcast series has really been life affirming for her. And I love hearing that. And wherever you are in the world, just know that I appreciate you. I do this podcast out of so much love for all of you, because let me tell you what, it is so confronting to sit in my office and speak to a mic for a half an hour to an hour. It is confronting. It makes you deal with a lot of my own worthiness wound, but I do it because I love you. No, that's codependency, right? I do it because I enjoy it. I enjoy sharing these things with you, and also because it just really continues to remind me that we can do hard things, and hard things doesn't always mean that there's something bad or wrong. Yeah. Sometimes doing hard things means growing up and taking life on. And so as much as doing this series can feel a little confronting for me, sitting in my room by myself, talking about this stuff, it's also really life affirming. It's also affirming to me that like, I can do this. You can do this. We've got this. All right. I'll talk to you all tomorrow.